Okay, today the San Diego Union-Tribune editorial board is joined by Mayor Todd Gloria and Councilmember Stephen Whitburn, and we're going to be talking about homelessness in San Diego. I appreciate you both taking the time today, and I want to give you a chance to kind of set up what's going to be happening at council next week, and obviously we'll talk about the downtown partnership and the regional task force on homelessness numbers, which just came out. But just to set this up, for the board and for those watching at home, we called what's coming to council on Tuesday back in April a hollow gesture, and so I'm curious to hear what you have to say to explain this policy, which we see as or at least saw. We haven't written on the latest editorial yet, but saw as half-baked and inhumane. And so, Mayor, why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us what you hope to happen in Tuesday, especially in the context of what we're seeing this week and in recent days?
Yeah. Well, Matt, I think the last time we were together, I remember Laura sharing a story about her most recent visit to downtown and how difficult that was for her. And I know that's not a unique experience. I know a lot of folks are experiencing this. And what I want, I think, more than anything for the editorial board to understand is that what Councilmember Whitburn and I are proposing is not simply the unsafe camping ordinance, but it's also the establishment of the city's safe sleeping initiative, which is a part of a larger comprehensive shelter strategy, which we have proposed and will be a part of Tuesday's agenda. So the comprehensive strategy, which is has a lot of interventions, a lot of offerings and services for unsheltered individuals, along with the expectations that are enshrined in the unsafe camping ordinance. I think these two things brought together will help to address conditions like what Laura experienced and what, frankly, all of us experience. You all work downtown. I live and work downtown, so does the council member. But this, unfortunately, is not confined to downtown any longer. Really, every council district, nearly every neighborhood in the city are experiencing unsafe, unsanitary conditions due to encampments. And when we are spending over $200 million a year, as we're proposing in this year's city budget and housing commission budget, I think we have the right and expectation to have safe and orderly public spaces for everyone to enjoy.
Councilmember, do you want to add anything at the outset?
Absolutely. I think that everybody would agree that the current situation is unacceptable. We have unsheltered people dying literally every day from overdoses. People are being hit by cars, various random attacks. We had somebody murdered outside an encampment that the Union-Tribune reported on a couple of weeks ago. Hepatitis. It's completely unhealthy and unsafe for the people who are living outdoors. And it's creating a lot of public safety problems elsewhere. We have had hundreds of canyon fires from people who light fires to cook food or keep warm, and those fires spread and put property in danger. And I'm concerned that it's going to put lives in danger as well. We have school children walking to school who have to literally go out into the street to get around the encampments. And of course, we all see the impacts on our neighborhoods. And I believe that we have an obligation to take action. And we are really approaching this at the city in a comprehensive fashion. This city council has approved every single housing proposal that has come before us because we know we need to add housing. We have approved every shelter proposal that has come before us because we know we need to add shelter. We have greatly increased nonprofit social services outreach to people who are unsheltered to inform them of the services and shelter and housing options that are available to them. We've collaborated with the county to ensure that there are healthcare options for folks. But we also have to have rules about when and where people can camp on public property. I think that that is reasonable. And I believe that where there are particular risks to public health and safety, it's reasonable to say that you can't camp there. I think most people would agree that people should not camp within 2 blocks of a school. I think most people would agree that it's simply unsafe to have people camping in the canyons, camping around homeless shelters, where you've got people going into these homeless shelters who are trying to escape drugs and other situations that unfortunately are all too common in the encampments. parks where you have children and families. So I think that it's reasonable to say that you can't camp there at any time. And then in other areas, other public property in the city, we're saying that you can't camp on public property if there is a shelter bed available for you. I think that's reasonable. If there's no shelter bed available for you, then we're not going to require you to move. But if there is a shelter bed that's available for you, then we need people to take advantage of that. We're asking San Diegans to spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars to help people get back onto their feet. And if we're going to continue to have the trust of the people that we're asking to help with the situation and who so generously are, then we also need people to take advantages of the resources that we're providing.
Let me just ask you a quick question with two parts. Maybe it's not quick, and then I'll pass the mic to my colleagues who I know all have questions for you. When we say that this is a half-baked idea, one of the things we're talking about is, and the city attorney just had an analysis about this in recent days. She said the city already restricts camping. It's already illegal. So I guess my question is, the first question is, why is this necessary? And then the second question also goes to the half-baked idea. How the heck do you notify homeless people that there are beds or are not beds so that they even know? And then how do you enforce it at a time when we've been talking about police staffing problems for months, and they've consciously not been restricting the existing laws, as we've reported repeatedly? I guess, Mayor, do you want to tackle those first?
Well, a couple things. Yeah, Charlotte, let me try, and Stephen knows this issue even better than I do. So, Stephen, whatever I may not get to. With regard to the ordinance, this is a difference than what our current law is. We are certainly clarifying what the law is, but we're adding the site-specific restrictions for sensitive locations like schools, parks, homeless shelters, and canyons, waterways. So that's a difference. But I also think that there's value in this ordinance by clarifying our expectations. I think over the course of the pandemic, our expectations of the community have gotten muddled. And whether it was following the CDC guidance to not disrupt encampments, the cessation of bail, not booking certain low-level offenders into jail during the pandemic, has created a different set of expectations are not what San Diegans signed up for. They frankly expect to have public spaces to be safe and healthy. And in some cases, that's not the case. It's the current situation. So there's that bit of it. Matt, there was the second part, and then there was the enforcement piece. What was the second part?
Notification and
notification. Oh, well, first off, I mean, so the way it currently works is either our outreach workers or law enforcement, depending on who ends up having to respond or encounters the individual, follows a progressive enforcement model, right? So there is multiple touches of information, education, offers of services before any particular action is taken. In my experience, and I think Gary can speak to this because he is out on the streets all the time with these folks, it is well understood what the process is. There is certainly a network of information. Folks have cell phones. They are in regular communication with outreach workers, with providers. They have an understanding of how things are. When an officer makes contact and is offering that shelter bed, or an outreach worker offers that, the current process is a little more analog than I would like, candidly. We should have real-time bed data. But what we do have the ability is to contact our ever-growing shelter opportunities and ask, is there a bed available? And we do believe on any given day, we do have beds available. Sometimes there is a challenge whether or not the bed is the best fit for the individual. But as we continue to make greater investments in shelter capacity in our city, that will become less of an issue. So there's that bit. With regard to the enforcement, Matt, yes, it is true that our police department is understaffed and definitely has challenges responding to all the calls that we get. But a lot of the calls we currently get are from encampments. You saw the shooting that happened on Commercial Street just last week. We recognize when people with severe addictions are clustered in a particular location, it becomes a prime place for drug traffickers to target, human traffickers to target. It results in other kinds of crimes that do generate calls for service. When we can effectively manage our public spaces, I believe that will become less of an issue. The final thing, Matt, is I want you to know this ordinance was developed with the input of our police department, specifically Chief Nizlight, his executive team, as well as our city attorney and others. This may be a challenge, but I will use a comparison or an analog, and you'll go with me on this. In my State of the City address in January, I issued an executive order directing city staff to process permits for 100% affordable housing projects in 30 days or less. there was some pushback on that from staff, concerned that that wasn't going to be possible, that they couldn't achieve that there was going to be too hard. Matt, we signed it anyway. And what did that happen? When we set that expectation, what is happening now? City staff is meeting that expectation. They're meeting and issuing those permits on that period of time. I believe this ordinance is extremely helpful for setting the expectation of the mayor and the city council for how our public spaces will be managed. And I would expect, and I will hold people accountable if they're not able to follow through and meet those expectations set by Councilmember Whitburn and myself.
And I can elaborate a little bit on a couple of those points as well. And let me just say I appreciate the Union-Tribune's engagement around this, both in the initial editorial and then in some subsequent writing after the safe sleeping sites were announced. Some of the concerns that were expressed mirrored concerns that were expressed at the Land Use and Housing Committee meeting. And I want you to know that we took those very seriously. And since the Land Use and Housing Committee, not only I, but the city staff have invested many, many hours in working to, in some cases, better explain the policy, and in other cases, making improvements to the policy to address the concerns. I think that what you're going to see on Tuesday is an ordinance that you and most San Diegans can support. In terms of the necessity of the ordinance, what we have used historically is an encroachment ordinance. Well, the encroachment ordinance was largely written to address objects that people leave behind on sidewalks and in the right of way. I believe, as I think most people do, that we ought to treat human beings like human beings. And we should have rules that are direct and straightforward, and we should have rules that address the issue that we are seeking to address. So let's not use a law around objects. Let's simply lay out the rules that we expect that are clear for people to understand, but also make it easier for law enforcement to enforce. One of the challenges was that trying to take a situation around encampments and human beings and use an encroachment ordinance to enforce that was complicated. And this is going to be just much more straightforward for everybody. And the second thing, so that's why we need it. That's a big part of the impetus for this, is to just make it straightforward and easier. The second thing is, in terms of the notification, you asked, how are people going to know? Know that we are not going to take an enforcement action against anyone without informing them that there is a shelter bed available for them in these large parts of the city where the ordinance will only be enforceable when a shelter bed is available. It will be a prerequisite that we inform the person that there is a shelter bed prior to taking any action.
What's the time frame between that? Say you talk to a person who's got a dog, who's maybe got a bad hip, can't get on a top bunk. Once you get through all that and notify them there's a bed that fits their purposes, when would the police then cite them? Could it be that same interaction? Would it have to be 24 hours? Like how do you define progressive?
So our progressive enforcement model has been around for some time, and it envisions 4 touches before someone can end up at risk of incarceration. We would, it has to be multiple touch points, at least 4. That's the education, it's the provision of a bed. I mean, it is, I think, very much aligned with what people would expect in terms of handling this in a compassionate way, to your point, of an informed way. But it's multiple touches. I mean, these folks will understand what the options are. And then if a bed is available, in, again, the citywide perspective, we need them to say yes to that. The prohibition for the sensitive sites will be constant.
But just so I'm clear, a quick follow-up, and then I'll let my colleagues weigh in. So, there are very set rules about 3-hour notification, et cetera, before you move someone's belongings and you have to take act. Are there time duration requirements in between those 4 touches? Like, could it be 4 in an hour? Does it have to be 4 days? What are we looking at?
They would come back the next day. I mean, it's not prescribed. It's typically complaint driven. And there's usually more than a couple minutes between. There's always more than a few minutes or hours between those interactions. I haven't really found, Matt, people who are unaware of how the system works. They're very familiar with it.
Thanks to you both.
By the way, let me just add that a big important piece of the ordinance includes how we are going to deal with people's property. You mentioned 3 hours. This ordinance spells out that we are going to provide 24 hours notice for individuals. And there are specific requirements about how the city will respect and protect people's personal property and preserve it for them. So you will see that that aspect of the ordinance is a real improvement in how the city is going to be treating our unsheltered population and their possessions with dignity.
And Matt, I should clarify, it's 3 touches. I said 4 a moment ago. The ordinance proposes 3.
The Boise law that roiled all the homeless policies in local governments across America says that the shelter that must be provided must be in a fixed shelter. So the tents that are being planned for Balboa Park seems like a great idea, but they're not, under the eyes of Boise, an alternative that the city can say is being offered and can compel people to move to. Has this angle been looked at?
Yes, the city attorney's office has studied that. It is actually written into the ordinance that the safe sleeping sites will qualify as shelters. So if somebody would prefer to stay at a safe sleeping site, they'll be fine. And there are also some differences between how Boise treats individual human beings who are outdoors and tents that are outdoors. Those are looked at differently under the law, and the city attorney believes that our inclusion of safe sleeping sites as an option for unsheltered people is solid and legal.
Let's be clear, the safe sleeping sites are not just a collection of tents on a piece of asphalt. We are envisioning security services, restrooms, showers, screening for privacy. To represent it as just a place where someone can be in a tent does not do it justice in terms of what our vision and what we believe we can stand up at 20th and B as soon as July the 1st.
These are essentially outdoor shelters. I, during the point in time count, spoke to a number of individuals who were living outdoors on the sidewalks downtown. And most of them said that they didn't want to be there. But several of them said that they also did not want to go into an enclosed shelter for whatever reason. They were concerned about COVID-19 or some other element about being in an indoor shelter. Every single one of them, when I asked them, okay, I get that. If we were to have an outdoor place where you could still be outdoors, you could still camp, but it would be, complete with bathrooms and security and meals and connections to services. Every single one of them said yes, that they would do that. And I believe they will.
I have a question about that. When you say services, I haven't really heard any details yet about what that might include for them. Is it substance abuse treatment? Is it counseling? And will they be signing anything that says I am volunteering to go? Yes, I'm ready to go. Or is that not possible or even thought of yet?
Well, I mean, we're going to get their consent, right, to the offer, and they accept, and then we'll get them to the site. With regard to the services, Laura, yes, it would be our expectation through our nonprofit partners to provide those services, also with potentially with the county. Many of these folks are currently accessing services. We want them to access them in a location where we can get them repeatedly. to get them. I want to be clear. This is not the end state. Our goal is not to have them encamped at 20th and B for the rest of their lives, right? We want to wrap them with the services that get them on their way to permanent housing that ends their homelessness for good. So we want to have those intensive services on site in order to accomplish that and have the throughput that allows people to free up that tent for the next person who may need it. But with regard to signing a consent, their verbal consent is sufficient.
Kent Lee offered pointed criticisms at the committee level of this, not really criticisms, just observations. Is he now aboard? Do you anticipate having the entire council support this, Mr. Whitburn?
That remains to be seen. We have certainly been engaging with a number of people in the community who have been strongly supportive of this. When I go out to the community, the vast majority of people are with us on this, and I have encouraged them, those who live in other council districts, to share their perspective with their council members. So I hope that other members of the council are hearing from their constituents about this. I'm not going to speak for any other council member here, but I know that many of them share the concern that the current situation is not okay. All of us have seen what has happened in other West Coast cities where there has been a lack of action and where they are now getting national news coverage for the situation on the ground in those cities. And we must act to prevent that. And I believe that this city council recognizes that.
On the topic of other cities, LA passed something pretty similar to this in the past few years, and we've seen that homelessness in LA doesn't only continue to be extremely visible, but is increasing. So I wonder how you guys are thinking about that, and if there is any evidence in other places that have used approaches like this that this kind of thing works.
Well, what I would say is we are taking an innovative approach with the comprehensive way that we're doing this. I'm not aware that other cities have approached this in exactly the way that we have. And that is why a number of other cities, particularly West Coast cities that have seen a simply intolerable situation on the ground, are watching to see how we do this. I am not afraid on an issue as significant as this, and on an issue where inaction in other cities has produced simply awful results, to take the lead. I think we need to take action. I think we need to take a bold step here. I am confident that this will pay dividends. But I also want to caution that this is not going to solve the problem overnight. We are going to take an incremental approach to this. We are going to start implementing this first around schools and in parks, places where I think there's broad agreement that encampments are inappropriate, and where there's tremendous public support for addressing this. And we will progress from there. But we're going to take an incremental, thoughtful, methodical approach to addressing this issue.
And I wonder what you would say to other mayors in the county of San Diego. We saw this week that the city of Poway passed something, or took preliminary steps to pass a similar ordinance in response to the one that the city of San Diego that we're discussing today, because there is a real concern that banning homelessness or banning encampments or whatever that looks like in San Diego is just going to cause people to move somewhere else. And so, how are you guys thinking about that?
Well, Belle, what I'm thinking is that it would be helpful if more cities got in the game when it comes to homelessness solutions. A city like Poway, that to my knowledge has no shelter beds in their city, is considering that ordinance. I believe there are other cities in our county who have considered or have enacted ordinances that prohibit camping, but they do it without the level of commitment that the city of San Diego has done, certainly in recent years, with regard to providing that housing. So here's the thing. If you are prohibiting encampments in a city with no shelters, where do you think they're going? It is evident in the numbers in this year and last year that folks are coming to the city of San Diego. And, this is probably worth a little bit of digging into. Homeless folks may come to our city. The truth is, when I talk to other mayors, the same issue is there too. It's a free country. People are able to move around, and that should continue to be the case. But with regard to the 18 cities in the county of San Diego, when you look at who is doing the lion's share of the work, where are the majority of the beds? The point in time count that was released yesterday shows that in 1 year's time, we've added 908 additional housing opportunities for unsheltered people in our city. Surprisingly, 10 of the areas that they look at in terms of geography have done nothing from 1 year to the next. And interestingly, several of the cities have actually reduced the number of shelter offerings in their communities. We're the ones that are doing more. And we're saying that in exchange for that investment, that we expect to have a certain level of basic order in our public spaces. So I guess my message to your point, to your question, Bella, is to have these other communities use the same things that we have. The safe parking lots that we've created, there are parking lots in every one of those other 17 cities. They get the same CDBG funding, home funding, ESG funding that the city of San Diego gets. They could use that to provide more services, more outreach, more shelter. They could take what the city of San Diego has done in terms of pro-housing policies and pass some of them, right? I read all the time in the UT about all the criticism of the housing policies that we're pursuing here at the city of San Diego, with no recognition that that is a part of a solution to our homelessness crisis. But again, those other cities often are not doing any of that stuff. So, as folks who are working hard on this issue, I think it is fair and appropriate to provide these guidelines, these expectations in our own city, largely because we're going to spend more than $200 million in the year ahead on addressing homelessness directly. Most of these other cities are doing nothing, and that is causing our problem to get worse. They need to be a part of the solution. They need to step up.
And I'm happy to add to your question around people moving, just to other places. That was a concern that the Union-Tribune expressed in both of its previous, the editorial board expressed in both of its previous writings around this was, where are people going to go? Is this just going to move people around? The answer is no. I don't think that's going to happen nearly to the extent that people are wondering. And there's a few different reasons for that. First of all, the first item on Tuesday afternoon, before we get to the ordinance, is going to be a comprehensive shelter strategy. And you are going to see a layout of a number of different shelter options, timetables that it would take to get those open, the cost of getting them open. The city staff has spent a tremendous amount of time looking at all possible sites to add shelter. So number one, we're going to be getting more shelter open. And as we previously discussed, the safe sleeping sites. There will be more sanctioned places for people to go. Secondly, one of the concerns was, and this was also cited in a previous Union-Tribune editorial, was that there was a map out there that purported to show that there would be nowhere for people to go. The city staff has put together a map that shows exactly where the sites are that would be where camping is prohibited regardless of shelter availability. And those sites are pretty evenly distributed around the city, number one. And number two, there are quite a few locations in every council district that are not covered by that particular restriction. So when we say that, you can't be within 2 blocks of a school and we need you to move from that 2 blocks of a school, there would be somewhere else where somebody can move to, number one. And once that person moves there, it would only be enforced if there were shelter available. And the last thing I'll say is this enforcement, as we roll it out, is going to be enforced in every district citywide. It's not going to be enforced just in one part of the city. We are going to do this equitably, beginning with schools and parks in every district citywide.
Can you give us an idea of what it's going to look like? I mean, will there be vans with city workers going out? You said the police chief was on board, and is there like some kind of set mapped out situation, how this is going to roll out. And the only thing I worry about when I hear this is when people hear that there's a ban or they will hear the word enforcement. I always worry that that situation, just like a traffic stop, could go haywire, could go really wrong.
Well, Laura, I mean, sadly, that's the situation today. I mean, there's always the potential for something bad to happen because these encampments are proliferating. They're getting more and more dense. And those interactions amongst the homeless individuals, the folks that prey upon them, make no mistake, drug dealers are preying upon these encampments. Human traffickers are preying on these encampments. And so there's bad stuff happening in these encampments today. To your question about how this plays out, the council member had it exactly right. Our intention is to do this citywide and to prioritize schools and parks first. We think that's the right and appropriate approach. What it will look like is very similar to our current situation. If you take the time to look at our comprehensive shelter strategy that the council member mentioned, you will see that it has an accounting of everything we're currently doing and all that we hope to do in the short, mid, and long term over the next number of years. When you see it, you'll see there's over 50 full-time employees that are performing outreach efforts in the city of San Diego on a daily basis. And so we already have a rich environment of non-police outreach efforts, and that will continue. You will have our law enforcement or police component of it, and these things will work in tandem, but we'll prioritize those sensitive sites. We'll reset the expectations, and we'll go from there. As the council member said, it's not going to solve the issue overnight. It's going to take some time. But we have to reestablish the basic sense that when you're walking on a sidewalk, you'll have it be passable. That when you're in a park, I was talking with a parent earlier today who was describing the fact that when they go to play softball with their child, they have to remove feces from the home plate. I mean, this is where we're at today. It cannot continue. It is not acceptable. And this ordinance will do a lot to communicate that while simultaneously growing the offerings that we have in our city to provide a more humane and compassionate place for these folks to go.
There are some other elements that will also address that. The implementation will include police training to make sure that our officers are cognizant of all constitutional rights of everybody, and that we are doing this in a way that treats people with the dignity that they deserve. We are going to have an education component to this to make sure that people understand what the law says. And I would emphasize the incremental approach. It is important that we get this right, and it is important that this succeed. Many other cities around the West Coast are watching, and I have every intention of seeing this set an example for how we can address the situation effectively and compassionately. As we roll this out incrementally, it will give us opportunities to assess how we're doing, make any course corrections necessary. But I think that we're in a place right now where this is well thought out. We will roll it out. And I think that we'll see positive results.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? This is one of the things that concerns me too, is we're only 15 months away from sheriff's deputies and police officers serving an eviction notice to a woman who had gone to Yale School of Public Health. And she's dead now because that situation went awry terribly. And we're having these broader conversations about whether police officers should be involved in responses where mental health is, issues are suspected or maybe involved. And yet here we're building a whole enforcement mechanism around using police officers who are armed to respond to situations with homeless people who may have mental health issues, may have addiction issues, may not have their full capacities or faculties. Talk to me about the wisdom of that. I mean, we're one bad situation away from this being a disaster.
Well, Matt, first, missing key context, right? I already mentioned the homeless outreach workers who are not armed, who are trained professionals, social workers, counselors, things of that nature that perform a lot of this work. I would argue the majority of it on a proactive basis. Mobile crisis response teams, which you all have written about a lot and which are now in existence and operating. We've advocated as a city successfully for the institution of care court, and we're continuing to advocate for conservatorship reform in order to better address the behavioral health needs in our community. There's a lot going on, But if the suggestion is that homelessness is a get out of jail free card, it is not. If you're going to break the law, you're going to interact with law enforcement. We have laws in the city, and it's reasonable to expect them to be enforced. And our officers, as the council member mentioned, are trained both to do this particular work, but also to interact with really everybody, but in particular, the homeless population. Again, we have an approach that has multiple touches to the progressive enforcement model. We do this again with non-law enforcement outreach, with our homeless outreach teams, which are law enforcement, but are plain clothes and perform this work in a very different way than a patrol officer. There's always risk, but Matt, please, you know what's going on in these streets. You know the horrible things that are happening right now that have nothing to do with interactions with law enforcement. You've seen the parks that get set on fire, the play sets that have been destroyed, the public restrooms that have been destroyed. We had a press conference earlier today when you have our city's park rangers and our parks director and moms who lead local Little League teams describing the horrible things that they're experiencing right now. And it requires a response. Now, obviously, we will do everything we can to make sure that these situations go as smoothly as possible. But to your point about the mental health crisis, you all did masterful work in describing how real that is. And I truly and deeply appreciate that, because we don't talk about it enough. And it's often confusing to people about what is going on out there. But at the end of the day, we can't have that be a reason why we don't have our laws enforced, and why we allow the currently really deplorable and unacceptable things to continue to happen on our streets. We have to have consequences for illegal and inappropriate behavior in the public spaces.
There's been several academic studies. Sorry, no, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say another quick follow-up for me on this issue. It's been brought up a few times here, is the equity issue. I've been covering City Hall for 20 years. We've been talking about, 8, now 9 council districts, and some of them don't get the attention or care that they deserve. Some of them get too much attention and care from, a law enforcement state, and they feel over policed. How can you guys look San Diegans in the face with and legitimately say that we're going to get equal treatment? We just had a KPBS report a few days ago that said, Black San Diegans and Latino San Diegans are getting stopped more as pedestrians or as bicyclists. So how is, and obviously the Black population is overrepresented in the homeless population of San Diego and elsewhere. So how can you ensure San Diegans that the equity issues, both in terms of how we handle this, where we handle this, and that we don't mishandle it, is going to kind of get done above board?
Well, I mean, there's no question that there have historically been disparities in policing, but that's not a reason to not have law enforcement. It's a reason to address the disparities. And we always need to be cognizant of that. We need to make sure that we are policing equitably. And that is one of the reasons why we have made a conscious effort to implement this in every district citywide in an equitable fashion. And I'll defer to the mayor.
Yeah, I mean, there's, to your point about different neighborhoods and that sort of desperate treatment, I've been asked by other reporters about this. There's nothing in the ordinance that is specific to a particular council district. All council districts have parks. All of them have schools. All of them have sensitive locations that will be treated the same way under this law. And I'm with the council member. There have been historic inequities when it comes to policing, and we're working to address that. We've established the Office of Race and Equity. We fully funded it. We're starting out on a process of training all of our employees to understand disparities and to address it. We're starting with the police department. We are actively and meaningfully addressing equity in our city. The question is, what are other folks doing? But I understand the real concerns that are there, but it cannot be an excuse to allow our sidewalks to continue to deteriorate. And when you talk about the desperate impacts on people, let's talk about the impacts on children who are simply trying to get to school. Let's talk about the impacts on a small business owner that's trying to keep their business going. They survived the pandemic, and they may now lose their business because they can't get customers or workers because of the encampments that surround their businesses. Let's talk about that Little League parent I was describing before and why they can't simply just go out and do what all of us did growing up and being able to engage in our public spaces and play youth sports. And instead, you have to move homeless folks along, look for needles, remove feces, and deal with the smell of urine at a ball field. I mean, there are impacts on everybody in this particular case, and I am sympathetic and compassionate to the impacts on the unsheltered population, which is why we're doing all the things we're doing to try and address it. But we cannot ignore the impacts on everyday San Diegans who are frankly fed up with where we're at now and are demanding change. The council member and I are trying to bring about change.
I have a question about how it could,
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go for it.
Go ahead.
There have been a number of academic studies that challenge the idea that homelessness in California is primarily about mental health issues or other issues. They say it's the cost of housing. And yet in California, there's been almost no attempt to use the policies that have been seen in Japan, in Great Britain, in Oregon, to build Quonset huts, to build things called Conestoga huts, to build small, cheap housing that can effectively house people. Manufactured homes are huge in Great Britain now. So we have ways of constructing shelter that don't require paying $500,000 per unit at a decrepit motel. And yet they don't even seem to be part of the policy discussion. And I just don't understand why. Mr. Mayor, do you think that folks have just given up on this because of CEQA? Because it seems to be promising and it seems to be working elsewhere, but it never even seems to be on the table in California.
Well, I'm not familiar with all the interventions you described, Chris, and I always rely on you to challenge me with new ideas and names of things I haven't heard before. But with regard to the housing production, I hear what you're saying in terms of the high cost of subsidized housing, but a part of why the state has designated the city of San Diego as one of the few pro-housing cities in the state is because we are aggressive on housing production. And you've seen that and you've covered it breathlessly multiple times about our efforts to do things like go beyond state minimums when it comes to accessory dwelling units. When our pursuit of Senate Bill 10, the housing affordability packages that we have passed, the Middle Income Housing Working Group that's currently, their proposals are before our Planning Commission. While we are not nearly where we need to be, we have a lot more work to do, which is why we're continuing to work in this space. When it comes to the building I'm talking to you from right now, where we're envisioning thousands of homes on this piece of property, the sports arena development, we're not just building a new sports arena for sports teams, we're building one with 4,000 plus new homes because we own that property and we can help bring down the cost. We're working on all fronts. We can do more. I toured our first modular housing property that's over in the Stockton community a few months ago. I see innovation that's happening, but it's not happening at the speed with which we need it to. And if we're going to delay any kind of enforcement and curation of our public spaces until our housing makes up for decades of underinvestment, that's a recipe for a deterioration of quality of life in San Diego that I will not accept. So continue to hold me accountable to push housing reform. We have supported and sponsored legislation in Sacramento, but we're not waiting for Sacramento. Again, in the case of accessory dwelling units, it does not require public investment. We have exceeded the state minimum because we understand we have to build more housing for folks of all kinds, recognizing that whatever we build accrues to everyone's benefit, including the unsheltered individuals who are currently on our streets.
But it's one thing to have housing reform that loosens up zoning rules and things like that. It's another thing to say we're using the completely wrong method to quickly and effectively shelter folks. In 1942, after World War II was declared, the U.S. Army put up Quonset huts that held literally thousands of troops in Hawaii in like 2 weeks. And those Quonset huts remain in use 90, 80 years later in Hawaii. I've seen them with my own eyes, and they're still intact, and they're barely ever reparable. But yet we have this model that says we can only build structures in certain ways. So I'm not talking about zoning reform. I'm talking about a paradigm shift to cheaper ways of construction that have only been around for 80 years, but never seem to be part of the discussion. So sorry about my rant, but I'll
no. But Chris, this is why I persist in this, because we are in agreement. We have to have more housing, right? But I think what San Diego looked like in the 1940s is not what it looks like in the 2020s, right? A Quonset hut, I'm not quite sure where we'd put that on the scale to which I'm familiar happened after World War II in that housing crisis. But what we're saying is, what's the 2023 version of that? That's taking a 48-acre parking lot and saying, no more of that. Let's put a bunch of houses on it. Taking 6 blocks of decrepit downtown office space and saying, let's put thousands of homes on that. And continuing to try and do that and show that leadership. So let's not, I understand the point about desire to see innovation. I think we're trying to do that. but we are a dense urban city, and we are asking everyone to do their part. So whether that's tall buildings in downtown, townhomes in University City, duplexes in Talmadge, we're asking folks, everyone, to do their part, and we'll continue to do that. But the problem, Chris, is that is going to, we have decades of underbuilding in this state. It's a part of why the housing crisis is as bad as it is. But I'm not willing to tell San Diegans they have to wait until we catch up with that underinvestment in order to give them the relief that they deserve when it comes to their ways that they experience our public spaces, which are currently in some cases not safe and not hygienic.
Thanks.
Before, I know we're at time, and before I get to Gary's question, I just want to make sure that any other board member who has a follow-up or a first question has an opportunity to ask it. Laura.
Just a really quick clarification. If somebody consents verbally to going with you, with the city to go somewhere else, are they consenting for a one night? Are they consenting for a week or forever? I mean, is there?
Well, for as long as we can accommodate them. I mean, but it's our, wherever taking them to a safe sleeping site will be a superior experience to their current occupation of our sidewalks. Those safe sleeping sites will have restrooms that are available, security, lighting, food, showers. I don't expect someone to go for a day and then leave. I mean, that would be their right as a free person in our society. But the expectation is that we need to get folks to actually accept these services. As the council member mentioned, a lot of them decline these services, which is unthinkable because it is not superior to lay on the sidewalk. It is not a safe place for sick and vulnerable people to be. And so I think when we get them into shelter, there's a reason why our shelters are very full, because people know that it's superior. The challenge often is in getting them to accept the services. And a part of unsafe camping, as you know, is about saying when there's a bed available, you can't say no.
Oh, just a quick
Mayor,
follow-up. Oh, go ahead, Tanya.
Sorry, just following up to that, what's going to happen, or in which situation a person that, I don't know, has a pet or simply does not want to go to shelter, are they going to prison? Are they going to be cited, or what's going to be the step for that?
So I appreciate you mentioning pets, because we do permit pets in our shelter system. That is a change in one of the barriers that we lowered to get more people to come in. And that's, again, why our shelter system is well utilized and, again, superior to the sidewalk. To your point, the progressive model is, as I described before, it is education, education, citation, misdemeanor citation, and the potential for arrest. They, of course, can relocate, right? If they're next to a school, which would be prohibited all the time. If they relocate to another place, I guess that would meet the intent of the rule. But what we're looking for is for them to accept the services. And again, we will continue to expand our offerings, but we can't do it while simultaneously allowing our sidewalks to deteriorate.
And just one last question from me. I want to drill down on this again, too, because I heard you, Mayor, say that you're confident that the city attorney's legal advice on the Boise ruling is good, but Mara's not here to defend herself. But let's be real. Some of the legal advice the city has gotten has not been up to par on a range of issues. So my read of the Boise ruling, which I read again last night, uses the word indoor. Like how do you get from quote unquote indoor to that this is a defense that the 500 plus spaces at 20th and B is a you know, a good use of defensively under the Boise ruling. I'd be curious to hear, Todd, what you think about that. Do you expect a legal challenge, and how confident truly are you? I'd be curious to hear, Mayor, what you think, and then also the council member.
I believe it was the council member that referenced Boise before and whatnot, but I will tell you that we have been meeting with the plaintiffs here locally, and they are supportive of safe sleeping. They embrace this and want us to proceed. As a part of what kind of changed, you know, my original sort of position on this, where I also would like to see people indoors. But as the council member mentioned, there are a group of folks that are out there that just simply won't take that, but will take a tent offering. And again, I can't stress enough. I mean, this you're going to later write an article about what it costs to run these locations, because it's not just a tent. Right? It's shelter, it's security, it's food, it's hygiene, it's services, it's housing navigation, it's a lot of stuff. So because the plaintiffs have indicated their desire to support safe sleeping, because the city attorney has made her recommendation, and because this is superior to the sidewalk, I believe that we'll be in a strong position. Obviously, anyone can sue at any time, and Lord knows that they do. But I would remind them that by suing, what they're doing is helping to leave more people outdoors on our sidewalks in far inferior conditions, far less safe conditions. And that would be on their conscience, not mine, if they choose to do that.
Thank you. Councilmember, I apologize for misstating who said what earlier, but do you have anything to add on that question?
I think the mayor covered it well. I would only say, for those who, for whatever reason, may prefer to camp outdoors, why wouldn't you want to go somewhere where you have a bathroom and security and meals and connections to services? I've spoken directly to, as I mentioned earlier, people who are currently living outdoors who don't care to be living in the doorstep of a small business or a restaurant, who would go to a safe sleeping site. These have been opened, or are going to be opened, to accommodate people who are living outdoors, and get them into a safer and healthier place. That's their purpose.
Thank you.
And I just really quickly want to ask, what is the public's role in this? I mean, what are you expecting? Are you expecting the public to be involved in reporting bad situations, or is this something the city itself is going to be the spearhead on?
I'm sorry, you cut out, Andrew. In reporting, is that what you said? Reporting the
Yeah, I'm
situation?
wondering, are you asking for the public's assistance in identifying places that need attention?
Well, I asked for the public's assistance to come on Tuesday and voice their support for this ordinance, which I believe the vast majority of San Diegans do support. On a go-forward basis, and they already use the Get It Done app to report encampments. They're at record highs in terms of the complaints that we get from the public, and they desiring to see an outcome. We'll continue to rely on Get It Done to give us some direction. But the truth is, again, we have over 50 full-time employees these are parts of like PATH and Downtown Partnership and Alpha Project, who are out every day. They know these individuals, they have the relationships with them, and they will be our primary point. But yes, we will continue to rely on the public. I believe that the public will come in strong support of safe sleeping. I think we're going to have the ability to help augment services there with philanthropic contributions, because people know this is a better option than leaving people on the sidewalk. I believe the public is not only overwhelmingly supportive of the Councilmember's ordinance, but I think that they will help us implement it, not just in reporting encampments in communities, but actually helping to provide the services that can help these folks in their homelessness.
And then secondly, we get a lot of letters from people concerned about the cost. Obviously, a lot of the money now, I believe, is some windfall money from to be used for that $200 million that you're talking about. What's the long-term outlook for this? Let's say it's really successful. Is this just the way we're always going to be? Because that is a budget item going off into the future that just sounds like a lot of money to San Diego taxpayers.
Well, we will always have people who become homeless, who develop a mental illness, bad luck, substance use disorder, and we have to have a system there to catch them and help them get back on their feet. So there is an ongoing nature of this. What is the solution going forward? Well, I think a lot of it isn't not having cleaner sidewalks that don't require us to spend the millions that we currently do on sidewalk cleanups and sanitation, the hepatitis A responses, the porta potties that we've deployed with 24/7 security, because you can't just have a toilet out there. You got to have someone there to make sure it doesn't turn into a den of prostitution and drug dealing. We are spending a tremendous amount of money to facilitate or to try and address the encampment conditions on our sidewalks. My hope would be that as we reduce the number of encampments on the sidewalk, that we can repurpose those dollars into services for the homeless. Otherwise, we're going to continue to deal with the police, ambulance, fire, medical aids, environmental services, hosing down the sidewalks for hepatitis. I mean, there's a tremendous cost to our current status quo. I think this is better money, better spent with regard to expanding our shelters and creation of the safe sleeping sites. And last thing, I would appreciate the editorial board's support for ongoing funding from the state of California. Much of our homelessness response system is based off of state funding, and that funding is on an annual basis, one time. We've never promised next year that there'll be money from the state. It would be very helpful to have those ongoing commitments. God bless them. They have been providing it on an annual basis, but that tomorrow is not promised. And what I know is that when we stand up these facilities and these shelters, we need to have them be there for months and years, not just one fiscal year. So your editorializing and rallying support for an ongoing commitment from the state would be meaningful, as well as the federal government actually expanding the number of Section 8 vouchers as well as VASH vouchers. VASH vouchers have been a game changer when it comes to veteran homelessness. and helping to reduce the number of folks who served our country who are unsheltered. That permanent rental subsidy is very helpful, and there's nothing that would prevent them from expanding that for the Section 8 program, which has been flat for a very long period of time. A reminder, you all have done great coverage of the fact that the emergency vouchers that were given to us during the pandemic, as well as the rental assistance that was given to us during the pandemic, we used every nickel. We used every one of those resources given to us. We can be entrusted with more. We will put it to good use.
Gary, all yours.
I had a question about compliance of Boise after looking at it myself. Boise says that in general, that you have to have a shelter available for somebody before you can cite them for sleeping outside, but it doesn't have exceptions. And you're looking at exceptions for parks and for around schools, and saying that you don't have to have a shelter available for them. So I was wondering what the interpretation is that falls into compliance with Boise when it's not actually mentioned in the settlement that I've seen.
2 points to that, because we have discussed that, and I've spoken with the city attorney's office around this. First of all, they are confident that in cases of public health and safety, that this will be allowable. So that's why these apply to sites where there are particular concerns around public health and safety. And the second thing is Boise, I'm told, is geared toward the individual person, the body who's lying out somewhere, as some people do in a blanket or what have you. It's not specifically taking up the question of tents. And one of the issues that we have here is strings of tents that are blocking the sidewalk to the point where people with disabilities can't get by. I mean, you've got a civil rights issue there too. So the city attorney's office believes that this will stand up under Boise.
Yeah, I'd refer you to the city attorney's memo, and I would just add that we do have the ability for time, manner, and place restrictions, which is why the permanent prohibition is at specific sites and a specific manner because of the public safety and health components of it. So that's why it also doesn't apply citywide unless there's a bed available. So we are, I believe, on strong footing with regard to Boise. And I appreciate the council members' acknowledgement of the fact these are trade-offs, right? So Boise versus ADA versus equal. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? But we believe that we have something that fits within the legal parameters and the restrictions that we have to deal with. And again, to use it as an excuse for non-action is just a non-starter. We have to take action on this. The city has dramatically ramped up its offerings of services and shelter for folks. We cannot continue to do this without some ability to compel folks to get to use these services and to maintain our public spaces in a manner which matches the expectations of taxpayers and the quality of life that we all live here for. My folks are giving me the high sign because I got to get going.
I appreciate it. Both of you have been very gracious with your time. These are tough questions. And even if we don't agree, I think we agree that it's a problem that needs to be tackled. So I really appreciate it.
Can I ask a very short question? See if the mayor wants to commit some news. Mr. Mayor, what do you think of the Imperial Beach Mayor's request for a declaration of a national emergency because of the sewage spills?
I mean, I've worked on this. I defer to the mayor of IB. I mean, she deals with this directly. From my time in the legislature, I know it is a disaster. And we could, if that got us the additional funding we need to actually construct the long-term fixes, we're a couple $100 million short. That would be meaningful and I think necessary. But the President Biden has been absolutely phenomenal on this issue in terms of appropriating these dollars, sending the EPA administrator here, helping to get the environmental documents done, getting the financial commitment from Mexico. But we do need some additional dollars. If that helped to actually effectuate the long-term solution, let's do it. People of South San Diego, including people in the city of San Diego who live in San Ysidro, Otay Mesa, Edgar Highlands, they deserve access to clean beaches and open beaches and clean water. Obviously, they have not had that for some time.
Thanks.
Thanks to you both. Take care.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.